Do you know Woodrow Wilson? The progressive racist president, Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States, serving from 1913 to 1921. He is often remembered as a progressive reformer and idealist, championing causes like the Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, and his visionary 14 points for world peace. However, Wilson's legacy is complicated by his deeply entrenched racist views and policies that actively promoted segregation and disenfranchisement of Black Americans. This dichotomy of being both a progressive and a racist has made Wilson a controversial figure in American history. Early life and racism. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 in Staunton, Virginia, to a family of Presbyterian ministers with roots in the American South. Growing up in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, Wilson was heavily influenced by the lost cause, revisionist narrative that glorified the Confederacy. His earliest racist views were shaped by the pervasive racism of the time and place in which he was raised. In his writings as an academic and later as president, Wilson expressed deeply racist beliefs about Black inferiority. In his book A History of the American People, published in 1902, he praised the Ku Klux Klan as an organization that arose to put the white race in the South in a permanent position of superiority. He believed slavery had been a benign institution and that enslaved people had been contented. Entry into politics. Wilson first entered national politics in 1910 when he was elected governor of New Jersey as a progressive Democrat. During his campaign, he made overtures to white supremacists, reassuring them he would not interfere with racial segregation. As governor, he blocked legislation to make lynchings a state crime. In the 1912 presidential election, Wilson campaigned across the nation but avoided speaking to Black audiences or addressing racial injustice. His strategists recognized that Wilson needed the support of Southern white voters and so did not challenge the region's entrenched system of racial discrimination and disenfranchisement. The segregationist president. After winning the presidency in 1912, Wilson's administration swiftly moved to segregate the federal workforce, reversing decades of efforts towards racial integration instituted after the Civil War. In 1913, the federal government introduced official segregation for the first time since 1863, with screens erected to separate Black and white workers in the same offices. Photos from cabinet meetings in the Wilson White House show a grim resegregated reality, with Black employees literally shunted off to room corners. Wilson not only segregated federal offices, but also allowed members of his cabinet to enforce policies to restrict Black workers' job opportunities and block their hiring and promotions. Many skilled Black employees found themselves demoted to menial labor or dismissed entirely from the federal workforce. In justifying these racist policies, Wilson is quoted as saying, "If the colored people made a mistake in voting for me, they ought to correct it." He relied on stereotypes, claiming segregation was in Black people's best interest to prevent racial tensions and discrimination. Wilson also introduced segregation to Washington, D.C., mandating separate bathrooms, restaurants, and theaters for Blacks and whites. These racist policies cemented segregation in the nation's capital and across the federal government, inflicting deep demoralization on Black Americans who had expected better from the nation's progressive president. Birth of a Nation and the KKK. In 1915, Wilson convened a private screening at the White House of the virulently racist film, The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted Black men as violent threats to white women. Despite condemnation from Black leaders and reformers who were appalled by the film's racism, Wilson praised it as writing history with lightning and helped legitimize its horrific messages and imagery. Wilson's deeply entrenched racist beliefs had a profoundly negative impact on his domestic policies and permanently tarnished his presidential legacy. His views on racial inequality directly translated into governmental policies and practices that codified discrimination and segregation across the federal workforce and the nation's capital. One of Wilson's first major domestic actions as president was to effectively resegregate the federal civil service system and introduce racist employment practices. This represented a massive step backwards from the racial progress and integration efforts made since Reconstruction. Segregated workplaces, with separate offices, restrooms, and amenities for Black employees, were officially instituted across federal agencies. Additionally, his cabinet members blocked the hiring and promotion of Black workers, restricting them to the lowest level positions. In Washington, D.C., Wilson's administration mandated segregated facilities like restrooms, restaurants, and theaters, cementing Jim Crow in the nation's capital for the first time since the Civil War. These actions roll back decades of efforts towards greater racial equality and integration in the city. Wilson's racist views extended beyond just segregation policies. He repeatedly rejected calls and legislation to make lynchings a federal crime, refusing to use his powers to legally protect Black Americans against racial violence. He also failed to support extending the federal franchise to African American men, aligning himself with the systemic disenfranchisement of Black voters across the South. Perhaps most damaging was Wilson's decision to host a White House screening and personally celebrate the horrifically racist film, The Birth of a Nation. His praise effectively lent the presidency's endorsement to the film's heinous depictions of Black Americans and glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. This helped repopularize the KKK movement at the time. By instituting segregation as governmental policy and emboldening racist narratives, Wilson's administration inflicted generational setbacks to the African American freedom struggle in the early 20th century. His legacy is permanently marred by the reversal of civil rights progress and the reinvigoration of racist ideologies like lost cause, mythology, and white supremacy. While Wilson championed progressive causes in areas like economic policy and achieved idealistic visions on the world stage, his domestic record on race represents an ugly contradiction that cannot be ignored. His racist views directly manifested in policies that codified discrimination into federal practices and sent profoundly demoralizing messages about America's commitment to equality. In many ways, Wilson's domestic racial policies planted seeds that enabled the further entrenchment of the Jim Crow system across the South in subsequent decades. His actions halted the momentum of the long Black freedom struggle and represented a bitter betrayal to the African American community who had supported Wilson's Democratic Party only to see racial injustices institutionalized on his watch. Ultimately, Wilson's legacy demonstrates the degree to which racist views and white supremacist ideologies remained stubbornly embedded in American leadership and institutions in the early 1900s, even amongst those perceived to be progressive leaders. His domestic policies reflected an appalling commitment to racial hierarchy and discrimination that should serve as a moral stain on his presidential record despite whatever other achievements he laid claim to.